Gideon Nash handed over a single silver coin to buy a shackled woman no one else wanted. He didn't ask her name, didn't look her in the eyes. But when he reached for the chain around her wrist, she pulled back protectively, clutching a small worn locket on her chest. One look at that locket, and Gideon fell to his knees. Because 15 years ago, he made it. For a daughter he thought had died in the snow. What happened next would unearth buried lies, stolen lives, and a reckoning no one in that town was ready for. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trading post as Gideon Nash approached with heavy boots and heavier thoughts. His weathered hands gripped the handle of his axe the same way they had every day for the past 15 years. Alone, purposeful, but empty of hope. The frontier town buzzed with its usual chaos of merchants hawking goods and travelers seeking supplies. But Gideon moved through it all like a ghost among the living. At the edge of the settlement, near a cluster of worn wagons, a crowd had gathered around Silas Ward's makeshift auction block. Ward was a man who traded in desperation, selling whatever broken souls wandered into his web. Today, his merchandise was human. Gideon stopped when he saw her. A young woman sat on the wooden platform, iron shackles around her wrists, her dress torn and faded, but her posture still holding traces of dignity. Her dark hair fell across her face, like a curtain hiding eyes that had seen too much. Something about the curve of her shoulders, the way she held her head despite her circumstances, made Gideon's chest tighten with a feeling he couldn't name. Ward's voice boomed over the murmuring crowd. "This here's a fine worker, gentlemen. Strong hands won't give you trouble. Starting bid is $5. The silence stretched uncomfortably. $5 was more than most could spare for a person whose spirit appeared already broken. Gideon watched as potential buyers shook their heads and began to disperse. The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, as if she understood her value was diminishing with each passing moment. $4. Ward called out, desperation creeping into his voice. Then $3, then $2. Still no takers. The woman raised her head slightly, and for just an instant, Gideon caught a glimpse of her profile. His heart stumbled. There was something familiar in the shape of her face, something that whispered of half-remembered dreams and long-buried pain. $1 Ward finally announced, his voice flat with defeat. $1, and she's yours. Hell, at this point, I'm practically giving her away. Without thinking, without understanding why, Gideon stepped forward. His voice, rough from years of solitude, cut through the morning air like the edge of his axe through wood. "I'll take her." Ward's eyes lit up with surprise and relief. Money changed hands quickly, as if both men feared the other might change his mind. The woman looked up at Gideon for the first time, and when their eyes met, something electric and terrifying passed between them. As Gideon approached to unlock her shackles, she instinctively pulled back her hand, moving to protect something at her throat. But Gideon's eyes had already found it, a small tarnished locket, hanging from a delicate silver chain. His fingers trembled as they reached toward it, not to take it, but simply to confirm what his heart was screaming. The moment his fingertips brushed the cold metal, Gideon Nash, the man who hadn't shed a tear in 15 years, collapsed to his knees and sobbed. Because he recognized that locket, he had made it himself a lifetime ago for someone he thought was lost forever. But what he didn't know yet was that touching that necklace would unlock more than just memories. It would reveal a truth so devastating that both their lives would never be the same again. The woman recoiled as if Gideon's touch had burned her. Her eyes, wide with confusion and fear, darted between his tear-streaked face and the locket she clutched protectively against her chest. The small crowd that remained began to whisper and point, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance as Gideon struggled to breathe through the storm of emotions crashing over him. "How do you know this necklace?" she whispered, her voice, but carrying an urgency that cut through his grief. "How do you know what it means?" Gideon couldn't form words. His massive hands, so steady when wielding an axe, shook uncontrollably as he stared at the intricate pattern he had hammered into that silver so many years ago. 3 small flowers intertwined with a vine, a design that had meant everything to him once when he still believed in forever. The woman's face had gone pale, and she was studying his features with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Her fingers traced the edge of the locket as if drawing strength from it, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "You have her eyes," she said, and the words hit Gideon like a physical blow. "The same green eyes she described to me every night before I fell asleep." Silas Ward, growing impatient with the scene that was drawing unwanted attention to his business, stepped forward with his arms crossed. "If you're having second thoughts about your purchase, friend, I don't offer refunds. She's yours now, fair and square." But Gideon wasn't listening to Ward. His mind was racing backward through 15 years of self-imposed exile, 15 years of believing he had lost everything that mattered. The woman before him couldn't be more than 20 years old, which meant she would have been just a child when he'd fled into the wilderness, consumed by guilt and grief. "What's your name?" he managed to ask, though his throat felt like it was filled with sawdust. She hesitated, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something she was afraid to find. "Mercy," she said finally. "Mercy Whitmore." The surname hit him like lightning. Whitmore, the name his Sarah had chosen for their baby girl, when she realized her own time was running short. The name she'd whispered with her dying breath, making him promise to protect their daughter, no matter what happened to her. Gideon's legs gave out completely, and he sank to the dusty ground, his axe forgotten beside him, because standing before him in chains and rags was the daughter he thought he'd lost forever. The child he'd spent 15 years believing had died with her mother in that terrible winter. But if Mercy was alive, that meant everything he'd believed about that night was wrong. Everything he'd tormented himself with, every reason he'd had for running away and living like a hermit was built on a lie. And if he'd been wrong about her death, what else had he been wrong about? What other truths were hidden in the shadows of his past, waiting to destroy what little peace he'd found? Mercy's eyes filled with tears as she watched this stranger, her father, crumble before her. The locket felt heavy in her hands, weighted with years of questions and a mother's dying words that had never made complete sense until this moment. She had carried Sarah Whitmore's stories like precious cargo, half convinced they were the fevered dreams of a woman who'd lost too much blood. "She told me about you," Mercy whispered, kneeling down to meet Gideon's broken gaze. "About the man who carved flowers into silver because he said love should be beautiful and lasting. She said you had hands that could shape anything but the gentlest touch when you held her." Gideon's breath came in ragged gasps. Each word from Mercy's lips was a knife twisting in his chest because Sarah had been right. Love should be beautiful and lasting, but his love had brought only death and abandonment. "You were supposed to be buried beside her," he said, his voice cracking. "The fever took you both." "I found the graves myself. Read the markers with my own eyes." Mercy shook her head slowly, understanding dawning in her expression. "Someone lied to you. Sarah lived long enough to give birth, but barely. She was dying when the midwife took me away. She made her promise to tell you I was dead, to let you believe we were both gone. The words hit Gideon like hammer blows. Why would she do that? Because she was afraid, Mercy said, reaching into her dress and pulling out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. She left this for you, but said I should only give it to you if you ever found me again. She didn't think you would. With trembling fingers, Gideon unfolded the letter. Sarah's handwriting, weak but determined, covered the page. His eyes scanned the words that would explain 15 years of torment. My beloved Gideon, if you are reading this, then God has shown more mercy than I dared hope. I am dying, and our daughter will need a better life than we can give her. The fever has taken too much of my strength, and winter is coming hard. I have arranged for her to be taken to my sister in the eastern settlements, where she can grow up safe and educated. I tell you this lie about her death because I know you. You would follow her into danger, and your guilt over my condition would make you believe you bring only suffering to those you love. Let me die knowing you will build a new life, not spend it mourning what cannot be changed. Find happiness, my love. Live for both of us. The letter continued, but Gideon's vision blurred too much to read further. Mercy watched him struggle with the revelation, her own tears falling freely. Now, what happened to your aunt? Gideon asked when he could finally speak. Mercy's face hardened. Cholera took her when I was 16. After that, there was no one. I made my way west, hoping to find some trace of you, some clue about where you'd gone. Instead, I found men like Ward who prey on women with nowhere else to turn. Silas Ward, who had been listening with growing impatience, finally interrupted. This is all very touching, but I've got business to conduct. Take your reunion somewhere else. Gideon rose slowly, his grief transforming into something darker and more dangerous. For 15 years, he had lived with the belief that his failures had killed the two people he loved most. Now he learned that his daughter had been alone and vulnerable while he hid in the wilderness nursing wounds that were built on lies. But there was something else in Sarah's letter, something that made his blood run cold, because if she had arranged for Mercy to go east, how had his daughter ended up in chains in a frontier trading post? Who had betrayed Sarah's careful plans? And what had they done to Mercy in the years between safety and slavery? The truth, when he found it, would demand a reckoning that would shake this entire territory. Gideon's transformation was immediate and terrifying. The broken man who had wept over a locket vanished, replaced by something primal and dangerous. His massive frame seemed to expand as he turned toward Silas Ward, who took an involuntary step backward at the sudden shift in the lumberjack's demeanor. You're going to tell me exactly how she came to be in your possession. Gideon said, his voice low and deadly calm. And you're going to tell me right now. Ward's eyes darted nervously around the small crowd that had gathered, but found no sympathy there. The frontier had its own rough justice, and most folks had little love for men who trafficked in human misery. Now see here, friend. Ward stammered, trying to maintain his composure. I bought her fair and square from a fellow named Preston. Had all the proper papers, said she owed him money for passage west. That's legal business, nothing more. Mercy's sharp intake of breath made both men turn toward her. Her face had gone deathly pale at the mention of Preston's name, and her hands clenched into fists. Preston. She repeated the name, dripping with venom. That lying snake told me he was my aunt's lawyer, said he'd help me claim her property back east. Instead, he robbed me blind and sold me to the first man who'd pay his gambling debts. Gideon felt rage building in his chest like a furnace. Where is this Preston now? Ward shifted uncomfortably. Can't say for certain. He mentioned something about setting up shop in the next territory over, but that was weeks ago. Could be anywhere by now? But Mercy was shaking her head. No, she said quietly. He's still here. I saw him yesterday coming out of the saloon. He's been watching to see what would happen to me, probably hoping to squeeze more money out of whoever bought me. The crowd began to murmur with interest. A story of betrayal and family reunion was exactly the kind of drama that could turn into entertainment or violence, depending on how it played out. Gideon looked down at his daughter. His daughter alive and standing beside him after 15 years of believing her dead, and felt something shift permanently inside his chest. He had spent a decade and a half punishing himself for failures that weren't his fault, living like a ghost because he thought he had nothing left to protect. Now he had everything to fight for. Which a saloon? He asked, his voice carrying the promise of retribution. Mercy hesitated, perhaps recognizing the dangerous glint in her father's eyes, the broken wheel at the end of the main street. But Preston isn't alone. He travels with 2 men who handle his dirty work. They're armed and dangerous. Gideon picked up his axe, testing its weight in his hands. 15 years of chopping wood had made him strong, but more than that, it had given him patience and precision. He knew exactly how much force was needed to split something cleanly, and how much was required to shatter it completely. Mercy, he said without looking at her. You're going to wait for me at the church. Whatever happens next, you don't need to see it. But as they walked toward the heart of town, neither father nor daughter realized they were being watched. Preston had indeed seen the reunion, and he had no intention of letting his most profitable asset slip away so easily. He was already planning how to reclaim what he considered his property, and he had no idea what kind of storm was walking straight toward him. The Broken Wheel Saloon squatted at the end of the street like a festering wound, its weathered boards and grimy windows speaking to the kind of business conducted within. Gideon approached with the measured pace of a man who had made peace with violence, his axe hanging loose at his side. Behind him. Despite his instructions, Mercy followed at a distance, unable to stay away from the confrontation that would determine her fate. Inside the saloon, Preston sat at a corner table, nursing a glass of whiskey and counting coins. He was a thin man with the kind of predatory smile that never reached his eyes. Dressed well enough to suggest prosperity, but not so fine as to attract the wrong kind of attention. His 2 companions flanked him, brutal men whose scarred hands and cold expressions advertised their profession. Preston had been expecting this moment since he'd spotted the reunion at the trading post. He'd built his fortune on understanding human nature, and he knew that men like Gideon Nash were predictable in their righteousness. The lumberjack would come seeking justice, probably expecting to intimidate a simple con man into submission. What Preston didn't expect was the way the saloon's conversations died the moment Gideon stepped through the doorway. The big man's presence seemed to fill the entire room, his green eyes scanning the crowd with the calm intensity of a predator selecting prey. When those eyes found Preston, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You're Preston," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. Preston's smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow by tobacco and poor decisions. "Guilty is charged, friend, and you must be the generous soul who purchased my former ward. I hope you're satisfied with your investment." The casual cruelty in Preston's voice made something snap inside Gideon's chest. This man had taken advantage of a grieving young woman, stolen her inheritance, and sold her into bondage without a moment's hesitation. He spoke of mercy like she was livestock, a commodity to be bought and sold for profit. "Stand up," Gideon said quietly. Preston chuckled and took another sip of his whiskey. "I think I'm comfortable right where I am." "Thanks. Besides, what's done is done. Business is business, and I conducted mine within the bounds of the law." "The bounds of the law," Gideon repeated slowly, his grip tightening on the axe handle. "You robbed an orphaned girl and sold her to slavers. Tell me which law allows for that." Preston's companions began to shift in their seats, hands moving toward the weapons at their belts. But Preston waved them off with confident arrogance. "The girl owed me money," he said with a shrug. "Travel expenses, legal fees, room and board, while I sorted out her aunt's affairs. When she couldn't pay, I exercised my right to recover my investment through indentured servitude. All perfectly legal." The lie was so brazen, so casually delivered, that several patrons of the saloon began to mutter angrily. Even in a place where moral standards were flexible, there were lines that decent people didn't cross. Mercy appeared in the doorway, then her presence adding fuel to the fire burning in Gideon's chest. She looked so small and vulnerable standing there, but her eyes held a strength that reminded him painfully of Sarah. "You want to know what's perfectly legal?" Gideon asked, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "A father protecting his daughter from men who would do her harm. That's not just legal, it's righteous." Preston's confident smile faltered slightly. "Your daughter?" "That's impossible. The girl told me she had no family." "Because you convinced her they were all dead," Mercy said from the doorway, her voice steady despite the danger crackling in the air. "Just like you convinced me you were helping me claim my inheritance when you were really stealing it." The saloon had gone completely silent now, every patron understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Preston's face had gone pale as he realized his careful web of lies was unraveling in front of witnesses. But he still had one card left to play, and it was the most dangerous one of all. "Even if what you say is true?" Preston said, rising slowly to his feet. "It doesn't matter, because I know something about your precious daughter that will change everything. Something that makes her more valuable than you could possibly imagine." Preston's words hung in the air like a loaded gun, and Gideon felt the familiar cold dread creeping up his spine. Whatever revelation was coming, he could see in Preston's eyes that it would cut deep. The conman's confidence had returned, feeding on the power of secrets and the damage they could inflict. "You see," Preston continued, his voice gaining strength, "your dear Sarah wasn't quite as noble as her letter suggested. Before she died, she made certain arrangements that involve a considerable sum of money that rightfully belongs to your daughter." Mercy stepped further into the saloon, her face pale but determined. "What are you talking about?" Preston reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio, worn and official looking. "Your mother inherited a substantial estate from her father back east. Mining rights, property deeds, investments worth more than most people see in a lifetime. She set up a trust fund for you, but with very specific conditions." Gideon's mind raced. Sarah had never mentioned family wealth, had never spoken of inheritance or mining rights. They had lived simply struggling through harsh winters and making do with what little they had. "You're lying," Gideon said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Am I?" Preston smiled triumphantly, The trust stipulates that the money can only be claimed by Sarah Whitmore's daughter on her 21st birthday, and only if she's accompanied by her legal guardian, since her father was declared dead 15 years ago. That guardian defaulted to me when I took responsibility for her care. The pieces of Preston's scheme began falling into place with sickening clarity. He hadn't just robbed Mercy of her small inheritance. He had orchestrated everything to position himself as her legal guardian, knowing that a fortune waited for her 21st birthday. "When do you turn 21? Gideon asked his daughter quietly. Mercy's face had gone ashen. "Next month," she whispered. Preston's laugh was like glass breaking. "Exactly. Which means I have legal claim to manage her affairs until that time. And after that, well, let's just say I've grown quite fond of my ward. Marriage would ensure that her newfound wealth stays in good hands." The suggestion hit Gideon like a physical blow. This monster had planned not just to steal his daughter's inheritance, but to force her into marriage, to claim it permanently. The casual evil of it, the calculating cruelty, made his vision blur with rage. "Over my dead body," Gideon growled, raising his axe. But Preston was ready for this moment. At his signal, his two companions drew their weapons, a shotgun and a long-arrowed pistol, both aimed directly at Gideon's chest. "That can certainly be arranged," Preston said smoothly. "You see, I've been planning this for years. Every detail, every contingency. Your daughter will come with me peacefully, or she'll watch you die in this saloon. Either way, she'll be mine before the month is out." The entire saloon held its breath. Several patrons had quietly moved toward the exits, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of what was about to unfold. But others remained drawn by the drama, and perhaps by a sense that justice needed witnesses. Mercy looked between her father and the men who meant to destroy them both. Her mind working frantically, she had spent years learning to survive on her own, to think quickly when cornered by dangerous men. And now, seeing Preston's smug certainty, she realized he had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated what a daughter would do to protect the father she had just found. "Actually," Mercy said, "see?" Her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "There's something you don't know about that trust fund. Something that's going to ruin everything you've planned." Preston's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" Mercy reached into her dress and pulled out another folded paper, this one sealed with wax and bearing official stamps. "My aunt wasn't just a simple woman living in the East. She was a lawyer, Preston, a very good one. And before she died, she made sure I understood exactly what my mother had set up." Gideon watched his daughter with growing admiration. Even in the face of armed men and mortal danger, she moved with the calculated precision of someone who had learned to turn desperation into strategy. "The trust fund you're talking about, Mercy," continued, her voice growing stronger. "It has a very specific clause that you obviously never bothered to read completely. The money can only be claimed if I'm unmarried and of sound mind, making my own free choices. Any evidence of coercion, fraud, or forced marriage voids the entire inheritance." Preston's face began to drain of color. "That's impossible. I've studied every word of those documents. You studied the copies you stole from my aunt's house," Mercy said, holding up the sealed paper. "But this is the original trust document with amendments that were added after you'd already made your plans. My aunt suspected what you were really after. She spent her final months making sure you'd never profit from her sister's death." The revelation hit Preston like a physical blow. Years of planning, of careful manipulation and calculated cruelty were crumbling before his eyes. But desperate men are dangerous men, and Preston had too much invested to simply walk away. "It doesn't matter," he snarled, nodding to his companions. "Dead women can't inherit anything, and dead fathers can't protect their daughters." But Preston had made one final fatal mistake. He had assumed that Gideon Nash was just another desperate man who could be intimidated by superior numbers and firepower. He had no idea that he was facing someone who had spent 15 years believing he had nothing left to lose, and who now had everything to fight for. Gideon moved with the fluid precision of a man who understood leverage and timing. His axe came up in a sweeping arc that caught the shotgun barrel and sent it spinning across the room. Before Preston's other man could react, Gideon's massive fist connected with his jaw, dropping him like a fallen tree. The saloon erupted in chaos. Patrons scattered, chairs overturned, and Preston scrambled backward, pulling a small derringer from his vest. But Mercy was already moving, grabbing a heavy glass from the bar and hurling it with deadly accuracy. It struck Preston's wrist, sending the gun clattering across the floor. "You've destroyed enough lives," Mercy said, standing over Preston as he cowed on the saloon floor. "You robbed me of my inheritance, sold me into slavery, and separated me from my family. But you made one mistake. You gave me back my father." Gideon stood beside his daughter, his axe resting against his shoulder. And for the first time in 15 years, he felt complete. The guilt and self-hatred that had driven him into exile were gone, replaced by something far more powerful. Purpose. "The sheriff will want to speak with you about human trafficking," Gideon told Preston quietly. "And I suspect there are other families you've destroyed who will want their own conversations." As the law arrived to collect Preston and his men, Gideon turned to Mercy and saw Sarah's strength shining in her eyes. The locket around her neck caught the afternoon light, and he remembered his wife's words about love being beautiful and lasting. "What happens now?" Mercy asked, perhaps wondering if this father she just found would disappear again into the wilderness. Gideon looked at his daughter, this remarkable young woman who had survived abandonment, betrayal, and bondage, who had outsmarted her enemies and saved them both with courage and intelligence. He thought of the empty cabin in the woods, the solitary life he'd built on guilt and regret. "Now we go home," he said simply. "We go home together. The inheritance would be claimed. Preston would face justice, and the Nash family would finally heal from wounds that had festered for 15 years. But more than that, a father and daughter would have the chance to build something new from the ashes of the past." As they walked out of the saloon and into the sunlight, Gideon realized that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't bought with money. They're found in the courage to love again, even after everything seems lost. If you enjoyed this tale of family redemption and second chances, please consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us with a super chat. Your generosity helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of the human spirit that remind us all that hope can survive even the darkest circumstances. Thanks for watching, and be sure to click on the next video to discover another unforgettable story from the frontier, where courage and justice always find a way to prevail.